They called them hexes, Nachthexen, the night witches, because at midnight when the earth slept and searchlights bent away like reluctant stars, women in slow, creaking plywood biplanes fell from the sky like ghosts, and the wind itself seemed to whisper death. The planes were laughable by design: stitched canvas, a single radial engine, wooden struts, and the scent of lacquer and oil. They were the Polikarpov Po-2s, two-seat trainers pressed into war, hand-built anchors that the enemy could not imagine would ever kill. Yet in their cockpits sat girls and women who had learned to move with the dark, who had learned to listen to the owls and the hum of the earth and to use silence as a weapon. The story of one of them, Katya Morozova, who learned to fall like a shadow and, with a steady hand and the softest of smiles, send whole columns of men back into the silence of their graves. Katya first heard the wind speak when she was 8, in the reeds behind her grandmother's cottage. They would set the nets at dusk and wait on the bank while coots pulled threads of moonlight through the water. Her grandmother would hum, and the wind would answer in notes like fingernails on string, soft, close, and full of secrets. Katya would close her eyes and pretend she could catch those secrets in her palms. By 19, she could read the whispered language of weather as well as any sailor. She could tell a thunderstorm from 3 counties away by the smell of the soil, tell when fog would hang heavy enough to hide a church steeple. When war came and the winter froze names on graves, those old habits mattered. The war was a machine that wanted only numbers. Katya wanted only to be a single instrument in the machine of night. She volunteered for the Air Force because the thought of staying in the factory filling sandbags made her chest tighten. Her father had been killed in '41 near Smolensk. His letters, smudged pencil on thin paper, smelled of oil and bread. Her mother folded them into the hem of an apron and kept them there like secret talismans. "You will not bring them back," her mother said when Katya enlisted. But there was no anger, only a basin of resignation and a hand that trembled when she tucked a scarf into Katya's color.
Training was brutal in that half-frozen camp outside Saratov. The instructors spoke with clipped voices. The girls learned to rebuild those laughable planes with hands that had once knitted socks and sewed uniforms. There were moments of mirth, tea brewed over a cartridge case, exams conducted by scarred sergeants with cigarettes hanging from their lips. But the underlying current was hunger and fear. They were taught to navigate by stars, by fields where midnight trains left 2 parallel smears, by the low cadence of rivers. General orders said they would operate at night for harassment and precision strikes, rail yards, fuel depots, troop concentrations. The brass secretly preferred the Po-2s for reasons of economy. The pilots called them bedtime toys. No one bothered to imagine that slow plywood could be a scalpel. Katya's friend, Polina, could whistle a lullaby so beautiful that even the wingnuts paused to listen. She would later fold that lullaby into the noise of engines to steady her hands. Another, Lita, kept her hair tucked into a cap and had once been a schoolteacher. She would later scrawl letters to the headmaster she'd left behind and never send them. They learned to work in the cramped cockpits, to pull 50-kilogram bombs from racks with gloved fingers numb from frost, to hold the throttle with a thumb sore from hours of waiting. They learned to laugh in the face of absurdity, because laughing was survival. "Remember," their commander said, Major Marina Roskova, a woman whose name was spoken with reverence, "the Germans have more planes, they have more fuel, we have the night." Her voice was thin but iron. She had formed the regiment from volunteers, girls who knew the language of the wind and wanted to turn it against the enemy. "They will call you witches," she told them with a dry smile. "Take it as a compliment. Witches fly at night. Witches do harm." They called their regiment the 588th Night Bomber Regiment when the papers spoke of them and clipped columns. Among themselves, they called it home. Katya's first mission was a baptism in the smell of petrol and the soft thud of fear. They took off at 22:30, one by one, engines coughing into the black. Katya's hands shook when she manipulated the throttle. The Po-2 responded like a shy animal, eager and stubborn in equal measure. Beside her, Polina executed the checklist with the calm of a woman who had just found her calling.
The flight to the target, The rail junction at Novosolive was a ribbon of dark land beneath them. Cities were smudges, fields were panes of different velvet. They flew in pairs, then in loose groups. The first time Katya turned off the engine, it felt as if the world had been pulled from the mouth of a fever. Sound dropped like a curtain. Only the wind over the wings, the soft squeak of fabric rubbing wood, and the steady breathing of her own lungs remained. Her instructor had spoken of the glide as a promise. You give up the one control you have, engine thrust, in exchange for silence. Silence was the true friend here. The Po-2 could glide on for miles if handled right. With wheels and flaps and nerves of steel, a woman could become the night itself. They nosed down and then cut the engine. Katya's palms went cold. The world tilted. She felt the planes sing in a different register. It was a low, rippling sound like a reed. Below, the rail yard slept with its lamps and stacks of rolling stock. Searchlights prowled like pale beasts, their beams sweeping the black. Up there, Katya tasted the metallic edge of fear. She was taught not to think of what might happen if she misjudged. Thinking invited paralysis. Bomb release was a prayer with a mechanical cadence. Look, line, breathe, press. She watched as the bombs dropped, small black commas that fell toward the sleeping wagons. A comet of feet lit one and it flared, an instant of honest fire, and then the night swallowed it. The Po-2 shuddered as the weight left its belly, and the plane rose in response like a breath. They feathered the glides, restarted the engines at low RPM, and drifted away, the world behind them stitched with new holes. Then, the fighters came. They were like iron hounds, sleek, fast, and confident. The Germans, Junkers, Messerschmitts, raced the air with an assumption of dominance. From Katya's cockpit, they looked absurdly large, like hunting dogs straining at too thin a leash. The first time a fighter dove at them, Katya felt a primal thrill so sharp it cut through the fear. She banked, and the enemy pilot watched with something like incredulity as her Po-2 steadied. The reason was plain. The Po-2 was so slow that fighters, designed for speed, risked stalling when they tried to chase it too close at low speed. That little advantage was a sliver of fortune the girls had learned to exploit. Polina, whose hands were never steady except at night, twisted the radio dial and sent out the last soft message she would ever send to her mother. Katya wanted to reach out and take it back, to deny the sky its permissions. Instead, she let the plane sing the way the wind preferred, and when a fighter came in tight, she dropped into a shallow dive and then rolled, the canvas wings creaking with strain. The fighter overshot like a hound that had overreached. They returned to base through a sky full of burning things. Polina's face was pale as milk. She had seen a burning train blink like a moth under a street lamp. Katya would later realize that the first night did not teach her to hate the enemy. It taught her to accept what was necessary. The true craft of the Night Witches was not just cutting engines, but how they used that silence to sculpt fear. A bombing run was not merely an act of destruction. It was a performance designed to disrupt sleep and nerve. The Germans learned that the sound of the Po-2's glide, its canvas throbbing like a faraway whisper, arrived just before the bomb hit. They would wake to a wind that seemed to be passing through the rafters, a sound their mothers associated with winter gusts and old roofs, and then the ground would bloom up into fire. It was the bait, the hush first, then the violence. Katya learned to play that sound. She could tell by micro-adjustments of flaps and elevator how long the glide would hold, where the plane would drift, and how precisely the bomb would land. She learned to skim treetops that were barely thinned by moonlight, to approximate the curve of a searchlight's sweep, to make the plane's shadow fall just where it would cause the most unease. Between missions, they repaired the planes in a blur of hands and smoke. Katya once replaced a struck bolt with a short nail and lacquered it until the nail shone like metal born for its purpose. The girls taped their gloves onto their hands to keep warmth, bent over engines that refused to be civilized, and told stories in the half-light to keep away the creeping thought that the war would never end. They smoked rolled cigarettes from tobacco stolen from supply trains and called themselves sisters in ragged joke.
Polina, whose hands were never steady except at night, twisted the radio dial and sent out the last soft message she would ever send to her mother. Katya wanted to reach out and take it back, to deny the sky its permissions. Instead, she let the planes sing the way the wind preferred, and when a fighter came in tight, she dropped into a shallow dive and then rolled, the canvas wings creaking with strain. The fighter overshot like a hound that had overreached. They returned to base through a sky full of burning things. Polina's face was pale as milk. She had seen a burning train blink like a moth under a street lamp. Katya would later realize that the first night did not teach her to hate the enemy. It taught her to accept what was necessary. The true craft of the Night Witches was in not just cutting engines, but how they used that silence to sculpt fear. A bombing run was not merely an act of destruction. It was a performance designed to disrupt sleep and nerve. The Germans learned that the sound of the Po-2's glide, its canvas throbbing like a faraway whisper, arrived just before the bomb hit. They would wake to a wind that seemed to be passing through the rafters, a sound their mothers associated with winter gusts and old roofs, and then the ground would bloom up into fire. It was the bait, the hush first, then the violence. Katya learned to play that sound. She could tell, by micro-adjustments of flaps and elevator, how long the glide would hold, where the plane would drift, and how precisely the bomb would land. She learned to skim treetops that were barely thinned by moonlight, to approximate the curve of a searchlight sweep, to make the plane's shadow fall just where it would cause the most unease. Between missions, they repaired the planes in a blur of hands and smoke. Katya once replaced a stripped bolt with a short nail and lacquered it until the nail shone like metal born for its purpose. The girls taped their gloves onto their hands to keep warmth, bent over engines that refused to be civilized, and told stories in the half-light to keep away the creeping thought that the war would never end. They smoked rolled cigarettes from tobacco stolen from supply trains and called themselves sisters in ragged joke. They wrote, and rarely sent letters. Katya wrote home less and less. It felt useless to paper over a life that had been ruptured. Instead, she wrote in a small notebook she kept hidden beneath the dashboard. It was a private log, brief, fragmented notes about technique, precise angles that had saved them, the names of pilots who had not returned, and sometimes a sentence about the wind. The wind was a confidant. She recorded when it had an edge of mercury, or when it came warm and forgiving. She recorded the sounds the Po-2 made in engine-off glides over stone bridges, and how sometimes that sound had been enough to make whole encampments rise in the night like a bad dream. There was a perverse humor to it all. They held bets: who would land with a bomb still attached, who would forget to switch on the lights when taxiing in, who would find a stolen plum in a seam of an officer's coat. But the humor was a thin veneer. Losses scraped at them like winter ground, chewing at mittens. The airfields were full of funerals in the dark, private ones where a pilot's friends tied a scarf to a strut or left a candle by a tattered wingtip. The wives of mechanics wiped their hands on aprons and wept, and then they would get back to soldering. "Don't count on luck," Major Raskova said once when they were gathered in a hangar and the canvas roof sighed over them. "Count on practice. The night favors the prepared." Katya learned to practice like a prayer. The Germans had a depot near Tikhvin, and word came down. Supply trains were piling up, and an armored column was scheduled to push west in 5 days. The staff wanted a raid to slow it, harassment to force delays, to make the column nervous enough to stop and look at the sky. On the fourth night, the regiment formed up in lines that looked like a flock at the edge of a cliff. Light wings, thin glimmers of propellers. They took off in groups of 6, the sky a long throat they had to pass through. Katya's wingman that night was Lita the schoolteacher. Lita's eyes were flat, steel under lashes. She had sent word to an imagined student that she might not come back, and had added foolish parenthetical instructions about how to behave in geometry class, which made Katya both weep and laugh in a dirtied hangar. They rose and fell, turning in toward the depot. The night was peculiar, cold with a heavy stillness that made the stars feel like things nailed to a blackboard. No moon showed. The searchlights were arranged like teeth. Below, the depot shimmered with the dull sheen of tarpaulins and engines. The column was near, thick and ordered, a collection of metal and men whose movements felt like a clock running toward an end. They cut their engines one by one, like a chorus of breaths held. The world narrowed to the view over the cowling and the rhythm of Katya's pulse. She felt the plane tilt, the gentle rebellion of the Po-2 working against her hands. She could see Lita's silhouette through the wing struts, all business and small bones. Somewhere to the east a searchlight sighed, and for a moment it swept their formation. A pair of fighters answered it and dove, screaming air in a way that made the hair stand up on Katya's neck. For a terrifying heartbeat, they shuddered under the threat, but the fighters had to pull away. To hold speed would be to stall. Out of the dark, a cannon spat, bright, sharp, and one of the planes behind them erupted in a bloom of orange. Katya felt the heat like a slap as the rising column left a scar on the earth. They pressed on. Katya remembered the angle of the flaps as if it were a lover's touch, gentle, practiced. She aimed at the depot, thought of her father's letter, and let go. The bombs fell like punctuation in a cruel sentence. Below, the tanks and trucks huddled. The explosions were surgical, the sound too close. A ragged applause. Flames licked up and oil sprayed into the night like dark fireworks. Then came the death dive. A column of enemy ground vehicles panicked, tried to scatter. A couple of anti-aircraft guns swung, their muzzles searching. A fighter had reappeared, more daring now, and it sliced into the sky like a blade. It made one pass so close that Katya could see a grin in the pilot's face. He thought speed and steel would make short work of them. Katya did not think. She cut the engine again. Every fiber of the plane and her body leaned into the fall. She found a silence so complete that it was a physical thing pressing against her ears. Her plane's shadow slid over the tanks, like something moving too quietly for a world that expected noise. The fighter dove again to meet them, a hunched shadow with teeth of metal. But his speed betrayed him. He had to slow to a perilous degree. His stall warnings would have screamed in his cockpit if he had one. They watched the fighter twitch and then stall, an ugly flailing thing. It yawed and dipped and, sometimes, recovered, but sometimes it did not. The Po-2s hovered like a swarm around a nest of hornets. Their silence was insidious. Ground gunners looked up and cursed at a sound that never reached them until the bombs came.
Katya released her last bombs over a cluster of fuel trucks. She watched as they detonated, how the fuel made the night bloom and then collapse into ruin. The fighter, battered, toyed with, attempted a last pass and clipped a wing of a Po-2. The plane spun, a slow, hollow drum of canvas and wood. Katya held her breath until her lungs shook. In the days after that raid, the Luftwaffe told them Nachthexen in dispatches that were equal parts disdain and shock. They published propagandistic cartoons of witches wearing flight goggles, which only made the night witches laugh. Behind the laughter, though, was a deeper truth. The enemy's underestimation of the girls' planes had become lethal to them. Winter pressed so close it felt like the air itself was working to destroy them. Food was thin. Mechanics conjured little miracles from scrap. Katya slept in a bunk that was little more than a wooden plank and woke to the taste of vodka she had not drunk. The letters stopped coming. Sometimes radio operators would intercept whispered intelligence about a convulsion in the front, a village lost, a river taken back, and the world would tilt under the weight of that news. They continued to fly. That was the point, to keep moving. The night witches had an effect beyond the tally of tonnage destroyed. They gnawed at logistics, interrupted sleep, and forced the Germans to keep men awake, watching the sky. Men were expensive when kept awake for weeks. The little plywood biplanes were cheap when weighed against the cost. Katya kept her notebook. She noted bomb site adjustments that had saved a life once, a gust pattern that often followed the Sinyaya River,
and the names of those who did not return. She made lists, and sometimes crossed them out, and wrote a new name, because the crossing out felt like praising the dead with ink. The list grew. In one ray, Lida's plane did not come back. They found the wreckage days later, a smear of char and a pair of gloves. Lida had been whispered about like a saint. They held a funeral in the dark, crude, quick, and necessary. Katya stayed until the frost had iced her lashes. Afterwards, she took the last of Lida's geometry notes and folded them into a pocket. Later, alone, she tried to solve an equation Lida had scribbled. She could not make the numbers lie down. Losing a friend tightened the focus into an ugly, efficient thing. Katya stopped counting missions by number and started counting by names. She did not let herself consider the future. The future was a dangerous place. Plans in it could dissolve into grief.
There was a pilot, older than most and called Zoya, who laughed in a way that made little sounds like compasses find north. She had a burnt face and a habit of leaning on her plane as if it were a perverse pet. They said she had once flown a dozen raids in one winter and come back each time with the grin of a woman who had stared at something vast and decided she would be its friend. Zoya taught Katya a trick that had cost her a wingman and given her a scar. "When the lights are bright," she said, referring to searchlights, "you want them to think you're the moon. Glide in slow, climb a little on their beam, then slip sideways. Let their shadow catch you and think itself clever. The trick is not to be faster. The trick is to make them think they could have been faster." The trick worked once on Katya's squadron in daylight that had become a gray storm. The searchlights blindsided them, but Zoya's guidance made of them a maneuver that was a small ballet. The fighter chased and stalled. The Po-2s dropped their loads and slipped away, as though the night had simply ended and they had gone to bed. "Cowards," a caption in a German newspaper had read. "Witches," another had proffered. The night witches smiled or rolled their eyes. Names were cheap, effectiveness was expensive. Not every mission had a bright result. There were nights when the silence did not protect them, when hazard was not a fare but fact. Engines failed on restart. One night Katya watched a friend touch the ground in a field of frozen mud and then not move again. The plane burned like a lantern. The ground crew folded their hands and cursed, and then returned to work, because grief was a luxury that had to be rationed. A raid over a munitions depot went wrong when a bomber's flaps failed to deploy. The pilot fought the controls like a man fighting the sea. The craft stalled low and folded, and the night drew a circle of fire. Katya later saw the field from above and recognized the charred ribs where her comrades had been. She wrote names in her notebook once more and underlined them until the paper tore. There was no time for prolonged mourning. The war demanded that their hearts be rationed. Still, small acts of humanity persisted. Polina would tuck sweets into pockets when she could find them, and a mechanic named Sasha carved a small wooden horse for each girl who flew more than 100 missions.
Katya kept flying. Habit becomes a kind of prayer. Repetition makes madness manageable. She wore Lida's geometry notes sewn into her jacket. When storms came and the night felt like a bared knife, she would touch the paper and trace equations like rosary beads. The numbers did not answer her, but the motion steadied her. As the war ground on, their raids began to reach further behind enemy lines. The Germans adapted. Night fighters improved tactics. Ground defenses were reinforced. Losses mounted. The night witches began to take even heavier risks. Some of them would not return. The raid on a strategic bridge near Orsha became a crucible. Intelligence suggested the Germans planned to move an armored column across at dawn. The leadership wanted the bridge neutralized, if only to delay. Katya's mission that night was one of the farthest they had flown. Fuel leeway was slim and the margin for error non-existent. They took off into a sky that was more black than a blackboard. The stars were drowned by clouds so low they felt like a blanket. Radios crackled, false alarms and nervous voices. The plane's fabric creaked and moaned. The instruments were fragile, and the maps were hand-drawn. Katya felt the old, familiar resonance, the fear that could only be tempered by action. They reached the bridge. Below, men and metal moved in sleepy precision. The girls dropped their bombs in a pattern designed to sever the bridge's approaches. One bomb struck a fuel wagon and set a chain in motion. The explosion tore a hole in the night the size of a sun, and the bridge quivered like a throat hacked open. Thanks for watching. We bring you real and true World War II stories that are never heard before. And subscribe for true and unique World War II mystery stories. On the way back, a fighter found them. It came like a thought that had been forbidden. The squadron executed evasive measures learned from too many meals of fear. They lobbed back through cloud and shadow, skimming fields and ridges. Katya watched as the sky itself seemed to split. Another Polikarpov Po-2 dipped and did not rise. They counted maims afterwards by the light of a dwindling stove. Some left the regiment that winter, others were removed by a hand that felt both random and absolute. The losses carved into Katya with a slow, patient knife. She felt memory like a backlog of small tragedies.
Years later, when the war had retreated into the margins of her life and Katya had a small apartment with a window that let in noisy afternoon light, she would sometimes remember the specific smell of engine oil mixed with campfire. She would remember Polina's crease of laughter and Lita's geometry notes yellowed with grease. Memory, in the way of its kind, made certain things larger than they had been, and certain faces farther than they should be. But in the middle of the war, memories were immediate and burning. She kept a small charm on her dashboard, a scrap of a lace kerchief she had once folded into a plane for luck. It rode with her on every mission. When the pilot's seat was empty, she felt it like absence. The victory that finally arrived did not speak in triumph in their camp. It came slow, in the retreat of columns and the thin, stunned look on enemy faces. There were parades and medals and a swell of voices that wanted stories of bravery to gild. The state wanted its icons. They gave a few girls the attention their deeds deserved, but much of their life remained the small, private thing it had always been. The maps, the lists of names, the notebook with the edge torn where a pen had scratched too hard. Katya never took to parades. She hated the idea of dressing up sorrow and presenting it like an exhibit. The war had been private, a calculus of loss and small comforts. She accepted a medal once and left it in a drawer. People wanted symbols. She wanted the small compensations. A warm meal, a letter from a mother who had heard the rumor and finally believed she might be alive. A safe night's sleep without the hum of cold wind against canvas. In memoirs, they wrote of how the Germans became paranoid, how the sound of canvas in a glide made men check their boots at night and curse quietly in their beds. Those who studied the air war would marvel at the tactics, cheap planes, improvised bomb sites, and the audacity of an entire regiment of women who used silence as their most lethal tool. But for Katya, the war was not an abstract analysis. It was the faces, Polina's lullaby that she could still hear when the house was quiet, Lita's notes tucked in a pocket, Major Eskova's steady voice, Zoya's laugh like compass needles finding true north. It was the engine cut, that peculiar terror and grace, and the way a small wooden plane behaved when in the hands of someone who had learned how to fall. The night witches, women of plywood and canvas, of laughter and knives hidden in smiles, had changed the shape of battle by refusing to be measured by the brute force of steel. They were proof of a simpler arithmetic, that stealth and cunning, practiced with devotion, could balance the scales of war in unintended ways. They were also proof of a more human truth, that when everything is stripped away, what remains is the steady, stubborn desire to protect and to act. Katya kept flying for as long as the world allowed her to. When she finally set the Po-2 down for good and walked away from the airfield, her knees remembered the shocks. She kept the notebook and the small wooden horse Sasha had carved and a scrap of Lita's handwriting. She learned to sleep in longer stretches, and occasionally she found herself awake at odd hours, listening for a silence that would not come. The war left its tracks in the lining of her eyes and the set of her hands,
But there were other things. A garden she tended with ferocious care, and a niece who learned to whistle Polina's lullaby without knowing where it came from. Sometimes, on nights when the air is perfect and the moon throws thin silver over the rooftops, Katya walks outside and listens. She thinks she hears something like canvas in the wind, a soft, deliberate whisper moving across the sleeping town. And for a moment, she is where the stars used to be, inside a darkened cockpit, her hand on a throttle, and the world trembling like something ready to be shaped. They called them witches, but the women had been practically saints of the dark, disciples of silence and steady hands. They had learned how to fall, and how to use the fall to change the course of men made of iron and appetite. That skill cost them dearly. It also made them, in their brittle and brave way, unforgettable. Thanks for watching. We bring you real and true World War II stories that are never heard before. And subscribe for true and unique World War II mystery stories.